Vanilla almost never became a global spice, because for 3 centuries, every vine planted outside Mexico refused to bear fruit. Hernán Cortés brought vanilla to Spain in the 1520s, and by the 1700s, European growers were planting it in colonial hothouses from Réunion Island to Java. The vines flowered beautifully, then died empty because the one bee that could pollinate them lived only in Mexico. In 1841, a 12-year-old enslaved boy cracked the mystery. What did he discover with nothing but a stick and his thumb? That question has an answer, but it starts long before Cortés, in the humid highlands around Papantla, Veracruz, on Mexico's Gulf Coast. There, deep in the rainforest, wild vanilla vines climbed native trees, and the Totonac people learned to cultivate them season after season. Vanilla was central enough to Totonac life that they built a myth around it, the story of Zanat, a princess transformed into the vine itself. Papantla still carries that inheritance in its name, remembered as the birthplace of vanilla. Papantla still marks that inheritance every June with the Feria de la Vainilla, a festival where growers from across the surrounding Totonacapan region sell cured pods and demonstrate curing methods passed down through generations. Papantla earned that title honestly. The vine itself is unusually demanding. Vanilla is an orchid, the only orchid grown commercially for food anywhere in the world, and in the wild it depends on a single native pollinator, the Melipona bee, a small stingless bee found only in Mexico and parts of Central America. Without that bee, or a human hand doing its job, a vanilla flower cannot make a pod. That dependency is the entire reason this story exists. That dependency did not stop the Aztecs from claiming the plant anyway. Around 1519, the Aztec Empire swept into Totonac territory and folded vanilla into its system of forced tribute, alongside gold and cotton. The Aztecs called the black pod Tlilixoquitl, meaning black flower, and required Totonac communities to hand it over on a fixed schedule. Spanish chroniclers who later cataloged Aztec tribute records described Totonac provinces owing baskets of vanilla pods alongside thousands of cacao beans and finished cotton cloaks every tribute cycle, goods funneled toward Tenochtitlan's markets and royal storehouses. A crop grown for ceremony became, almost overnight, an instrument of imperial extraction. The first time vanilla changed hands under pressure. It would not be the last. The tribute the Aztecs collected did not sit in storage. Aztec nobility treated zocolatl as a drink for rulers and priests, not commoners, and vanilla was one of several prized flavorings, alongside chili and honey, used to dress up a drink otherwise built on raw, bitter cacao. Cortés recognized status when he saw it. A flavor reserved for an emperor was, in his eyes, worth taking home. The next hand to take vanilla was Spanish. Hernán Cortés arrived at the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan in 1519, stayed through the encounter's unraveling into 1520, and in that court watched Emperor Moctezuma II drink the vanilla-laced zocolatl himself. That unraveling reached its low point on the night of June 30th, 1520, remembered as La Noche Triste, when Cortés's forces fled the city under attack and lost most of the gold they had seized, though the botanical samples he carried survived the retreat. By the early 1520s, he had shipped vanilla pods back across the Atlantic to Spain, packed in with cacao and other plundered goods. A Totonac and Aztec secret carried into a European court that had no idea what it was looking at. When Cortés presented his discoveries to the Spanish court under King Charles V, chocolate and vanilla together made an immediate impression on an audience that had never tasted either. The name itself came from that voyage. Spanish speakers called the pod vainilla, a diminutive of vaina, meaning little pod or little sheath. a plain, functional name for a plant nobody in Europe yet understood. That practical Spanish word is the one the world eventually adopted, Totonac ceremony and Aztec tribute reduced to a description of shape. That European court quickly decided it liked the taste. Within a few decades, vanilla had worked its way into royal kitchens from Madrid to Paris, stirred into chocolate drinks, and folded into pastries for aristocrats who had never seen a vanilla orchid. Demand outran supply almost immediately, because nobody in Europe had the one thing that made vanilla possible in Mexico: the knowledge, passed down through Totonac hands, of how to grow and pollinate the plant. That recognition traveled fast once it reached England. Queen Elizabeth I's own apothecary, Hugh Morgan, is credited with the idea of using vanilla as a flavoring in its own right, separate from chocolate. Morgan served the Queen's household from the 1560s onward, and his surviving inventories from that period already list vanilla pods purchased on their own, separate from any cacao shipment. An early sign the two ingredients were starting to go their separate ways in English kitchens. The idea spread quickly, and vanilla was soon flavoring ice creams, custards, and pastries across European courts on its own terms. Without that knowledge, European growers were stuck importing every pod from Mexico at Mexico's price. Botanists tried planting vanilla cuttings in hothouses and colonial gardens, and the vines grew just fine, climbing and leafing out normally. French naturalist Jean-Baptiste Fusé-Aublet catalogued vanilla growing in French Guiana as early as 1775, and Réunion planters logged their own first cuttings arriving from the Philippines in 1819. Each new attempt met with the identical outcome as the ones before it. What never happened was fruit. For close to 300 years, from Cortes's shipment in the 1520s almost to the middle of the 1800s, not one grower outside Mexico managed to get a vanilla vine to produce a single pod. None of that stopped colonial powers from trying harder rather than differently. Through the 1700s and deep into the 1800s, planters carried vanilla cuttings to Réunion Island, known then as Bourbon Island, and to Java and other tropical colonies that shared Mexico's climate almost exactly. The vines responded as they always had: vigorous growth, healthy leaves, and flowers that opened fragrant and perfect on schedule. Perfect flowers and empty vines turned out to be the same story on every island. Almost none of those flowers ever set fruit, and for decades nobody could explain why. Soil was fine, climate was fine, the plant looked healthy in every visible way. The missing piece wasn't in the ground or the air, it was inside the flower. That missing piece got a name in 1836, when Belgian botanist Charles Morren worked out what generations of colonial planters had missed. Morren held the chair of botany at the University of Liège and published the discovery the following year, in 1837, laying out the mechanism in enough detail that any careful reader could have repeated his hand pollination experiment. Yet almost none did. Vanilla flowers, he found, seal their own male and female parts apart with a thin membrane, so the plant cannot pollinate itself and has no local insect to do the job outside Mexico. Morren proved the vines were never sterile. They were orphaned, cut off from whatever pollinator handled the job back home. That membrane has a name: the rostellum, a small flap of tissue that keeps the flower's pollen sealed away from its own stigma. In Mexico, a Melipona bee is exactly the right size and shape to nudge the rostellum aside while foraging, brushing pollen across in the process. Ship the vine anywhere that bee doesn't live, and the flower keeps its pollen locked away forever. Proving the problem and solving it at scale turned out to be two different things. Morren's hand pollination method worked, technically, but it was slow and delicate. better suited to a single prized specimen than a field of hundreds of vines flowering in the same short window. Plantation owners now knew what vanilla needed. They still had no practical way to give it to enough flowers fast enough to matter. That practical answer came from someone nobody would have expected. In 1841, an enslaved 12-year-old named Edmund Albius, living on a plantation on Réunion Island, studied how the flowers' parts were arranged and worked out a faster way to do what Morren had only managed slowly. Using a thin sliver of wood or a blade of grass, he lifted the membrane separating the flower's male and female organs, then pressed the two together with his thumb. Albius made this discovery while enslaved on the Réunion estate of Bellier-Beaumont, a plantation owner with a serious interest in botany. Bellier-Beaumont's estate sat near Sainte Suzanne on Réunion's northeastern coast, where he had kept a handful of vanilla vines purely as a botanical curiosity for years before his young gardener turned them into the seed of an entire export industry. Slavery in French colonies was not abolished until 1848, 7 years after Albius solved the problem that made Réunion's vanilla industry possible. When freedom came, he took the surname Albius, from the Latin word for white, a quiet nod to the pale flower that had defined his life's contribution. That single motion changed vanilla's economics. What took Morren's method minutes took Albius seconds, and it worked reliably on flower after flower. A technique invented by a child with no formal training in botany turned out to be the piece of engineering the colonial vanilla industry had been missing for 3 centuries. Hand pollinators today, working orchards on the other side of the planet, still use this same stick and thumb motion, unchanged since 1841. Once that motion could be taught, vanilla stopped being a Mexican monopoly. Réunion, Madagascar, and the nearby Comoros Islands began producing vanilla commercially using Albius's technique, and the trade took the name Bourbon vanilla after Réunion's old colonial name. Madagascar had more arable land and labor than its neighbors, and used both aggressively. Dutch colonial administrators picked up the same technique and carried it to Java, the same island where growers had failed for decades under the old approach. Java became a second vanilla-growing region almost as soon as word of the Réunion method crossed colonial trade networks. The fix, once known, traveled nearly as fast as the vine's cuttings once had. Aggressive expansion paid off fast. By the early 20th century, Madagascar had overtaken every rival, including Mexico, to become the world's leading vanilla producer, a position built on a technique it did not invent but adopted at a scale nobody else matched. By the 1930s, Madagascar's annual vanilla exports had grown large enough to outstrip Réunion, the Comoros, and every other bourbon method grower combined, a lead built in barely 2 generations. That lead has never seriously been challenged. Madagascar still supplies roughly 80% of the world's natural vanilla today, a dominance tracing straight back to a plantation flower in 1841. That scale required more than land. In the wild, a vanilla vine can climb more than 100 feet up a host tree chasing sunlight. On a plantation, workers prune it back hard, training it into a shoulder-height loop so a person can reach every flower without a ladder. The same principle running through the whole industry. Bend the plant's biology just enough to fit a human hand. That bend runs on a clock the plant itself sets, and the clock is brutal. A vanilla orchid flower opens for about 24 hours, and if it isn't pollinated in that window, it dies unfertilized. No second chance. During flowering season, every flower on every vine has to be checked and pollinated by hand every morning across the entire plantation before the window closes. There is no machine gentle and fast enough to replace that morning ritual, And there hasn't been one in the nearly 200 years since Albius invented the technique. Mass mechanization keeps failing against the same 24-hour wall that stumped every colonial botanist before 1841. The plant that could finally be grown outside Mexico turned out to demand a permanent army of human hands to keep growing it at all. That demand for hands has pulled children into the work too. Because pollination season rewards speed, and small hands work well against tiny flowers, child labor has been documented on vanilla farms in Madagascar, the harvest window forcing everyone available into the fields. Getting a pollinated flower to become a pod is only step one, and the pod that results is nowhere close to finished. Freshly picked, green vanilla has almost no scent and almost no flavor. Nothing like the dark, fragrant bean people picture. Curers call what happens next the bourbon method, and it runs in 4 stages. Killing the pod in hot water to stop it ripening, sweating it in blankets to start the chemical transformation, drying it slowly in the sun, and conditioning it. Resting the cured beans in closed boxes for weeks so their flavor evens out before grading. The killing stage typically holds pods in water between 63 and 65 degrees Celsius for about 3 minutes, just long enough to halt the plant's own ripening enzymes without cooking the bean itself. Each stage takes real time and constant attention, turning pods by hand every day, watching for mold and moisture throughout. Add it up, and the full cure runs 3 to 6 months, stacking a second-long labor process on top of the hand pollination that started it. 2 long labor processes stacked on top of each other are why vanilla costs what it costs. Between the hand pollination and months of curing, vanilla has become the second most expensive spice in the world, trailing only saffron, and every bean sold carries that labor cost baked in before it reaches a kitchen or factory. Even when prices reflect that labor, most of the value rarely reaches the smallholder who grew and pollinated the vine. Middlemen, exporters, and international buyers capture the largest share of what a bottle of vanilla extract sells for, leaving farmers exposed to the volatility without a matching share of the reward. Almost none of that value reached the person who made it possible. Edmund Albius, the boy whose stick-and-thumb technique underpins the entire global vanilla industry, died in poverty around 1880, decades after his method had already become standard across Réunion, Madagascar, and beyond. Commercial vanilla ran on his invention for a generation before anyone credited him for it. Réunion has worked in later years to correct the record, with statues, schools, and public honors on the island, now carrying Albius's name. Decades after the industry, his method built made others wealthy without paying him a share. Albius's poverty is one kind of injustice built into who profits from labor. What happened next in Germany was a different threat, aimed at the value of the hand-grown crop itself. In 1874, chemists Wilhelm Haarmann and Karl Reimer worked out how to synthesize vanillin, the compound responsible for most of vanilla's characteristic flavor, starting from coniferin, a substance extracted from pine bark. Haarmann's company did not fade after 1874. It grew into Haarmann and Reimer, a chemical firm that spent the next century refining synthetic flavor production, and survives today as part of Symrise, one of the largest flavor and fragrance manufacturers on Earth. A discovery aimed at undercutting a Réunion plantation crop ended up founding an entire branch of the industrial flavor business. That synthesis produced something the vanilla trade had never faced, a cheap, mass-producible flavor that needed no orchid, no hand pollination, and no months of curing. Every plantation built on Albius's technique now had a competitor that could undercut it on price without doing a single hour of the labor vanilla demanded. The threat wasn't theoretical. It was chemistry, and it worked. Chemistry kept winning for the next century and a half. Synthetic vanillin, made today mainly from wood pulp lignin or a petrochemical called guaiacol, now accounts for an estimated 99% of the vanilla flavoring used in food worldwide. Actual cured vanilla pods, grown and pollinated, and cured by hand, supply only a small fraction of that demand. Vanilla remains the best-selling ice cream flavor in the United States, and flavors everything from candles to perfume to baked goods worldwide, largely thanks to the cheap synthetic version riding on a reputation the real pod built centuries earlier. That imbalance defines the modern vanilla farmer's position. Every grower walking a plantation before sunrise, pollinating flowers one by one, is competing against a laboratory process that skips the orchid entirely. Natural vanilla now survives on a shrinking premium market, not the mass market it once supplied, depending on farmers bearing labor synthetic vanillin never had to. Consumer habits shifted again in the 21st century as major food brands responded to clean label pressure by switching packaged goods away from artificial vanillin toward flavoring labeled natural. That shift didn't change the underlying math. Real vanilla still costs vastly more to produce, but it carved out new demand for authentic pods as shoppers started reading ingredient labels more closely. A shrinking premium market is a fragile one, and Madagascar learned how fragile in March 2017. Cyclone And Chaos tore through the Sava region, the center of the country's vanilla-growing country, arriving just before that year's pollination season was set to begin. And Chaos made landfall near Antalaha on March 7, 2017, as a Category 4 equivalent storm with sustained winds near 205 kilometers per hour, the most powerful cyclone to strike Madagascar in over a decade. The Sava region takes its name from the districts it spans: Sambava, Antalaha, Vohemar, and Andapa, and is where most of Madagascar's vanilla grows, much of it tended by smallholder farmers with only a few dozen vines each. A storm that hits Sava does not hit a diversified economy. It hits the one crop tens of thousands of families depend on for a year's income. The storm destroyed a large share of the harvest before a single flower had opened, wiping out months of coming labor in hours. Because Madagascar supplies most of the world's natural vanilla, there was no second major producer to absorb the loss. One cyclone hitting one region sent damage rippling through kitchens, factories, and price sheets on every continent. That ripple hit prices harder than almost anyone expected. Vanilla spiked to roughly $600 per kilogram in 2017 and 2018, briefly making it more valuable, pound for pound, than silver. A crop worth more than a precious metal is worth stealing, and pod theft spread fast across Madagascar's farms as desperate people tried to cash in before legitimate harvest began. Madagascar's government now sets an official start date for the vanilla harvest each year, an attempt to stop farmers picking pods too early out of fear they'll be stolen. Picking green, immature pods ruins their flavor, so a harvest date meant to protect farmers from theft ends up threatening the very quality that makes their vanilla valuable. Farmers fought back the only way they could, official start date or not. They organized night patrols to guard their fields and marked individual pods with unique codes to prove ownership in a theft dispute. Some confrontations turned violent, with vigilante attacks reported against suspected thieves, a sign of how far the price spike had pushed an already exhausting industry. That spike did not last. Farmers across Madagascar and newer growing regions like Uganda and Papua New Guinea rushed to plant more vines in response to the windfall, and by the early 2020s, a wave of new supply had pushed prices sharply back down, hollowing out incomes for growers who had borrowed and expanded during the boom. Vanilla farming had proven, once again, that it runs on a boom and bust cycle, almost as brutal as the storms that trigger it. Even at $600 a kilogram, against a synthetic rival that costs almost nothing, real vanilla never disappeared from the market. The reason comes down to chemistry, not sentiment. Natural vanilla contains more than 200 distinct flavor and aroma compounds, built up slowly over months of curing. Synthetic vanillin reproduces exactly one of them. Those 200 compounds include vanillin as the dominant note, but also vanillic acid, anisole alcohol, and dozens of other aldehydes and phenolics that shift ratio from region to region and harvest to harvest. That variation is what a single synthetic molecule can never reproduce. Natural vanilla isn't one flavor. It's a moving target built from an entire curing process, not a formula. That gap between one compound and 200 is why perfumers, pastry chefs, and premium beverage makers keep paying steep prices for real cured pods, no matter how cheap the synthetic alternative gets. A century and a half of chemistry never closed it. It's the only reason natural vanilla still has a market at all. Not every vanilla-growing region produces the same flavor. Tahiti grows a different species entirely, Vanilla tahitensis, prized for a fruitier, more floral profile than the classic bourbon character from Madagascar and Réunion. Indonesia, Uganda, and Papua New Guinea have all entered the trade more recently, each adding its own regional variation to a market a single Mexican vine started centuries earlier. Once cured, pods from any of those regions are bundled and graded by length and moisture content, then either sold whole or steeped in alcohol to produce vanilla extract, the form most kitchens use. Mexico, the country where vanilla began, now grows only a small fraction of the world's supply, its own vanilla region overshadowed by the very islands its plant once refused to fruit on. That market, small as it is next to the synthetic one, still runs entirely on a technique invented in 1841. Every vanilla pod grown outside Mexico today, in Madagascar, Réunion, Indonesia, Uganda, and every other region the crop has reached, is hand-pollinated using Edmund Albius's original method. Growers still use a thin stick or a thorn, finishing the motion with a human thumb. They still do it flower by flower, one plant at a time, because in nearly 200 years, nobody has found anything that works better. A 12-year-old's discovery in 1841 isn't a historical footnote in a museum. It's the working method behind every real vanilla pod on Earth. Un be ois tuch, savid vanilla forever. 3 centuries of empty flowers ended with a sliver of wood and a boy's thumb, not a king's fortune or a chemist's lab. Every real vanilla pod you'll ever taste, however far it traveled to reach you, still exists because of that one motion, repeated by hand, flower by flower, every morning since. If that story changed how you'll taste vanilla next time, stick around for more history hiding in plain sight.